I see that I am being recorded. That is an issue that will come up a little bit later in this talk. So let me start from somewhere else. Torah tells us that this world that we perceive daily, the things that we touch, the things that we see, the physical world is just the tip of an iceberg. That there is an invisible spiritual world which is infinitely greater than this physical world which we encounter every day. Not only is there an invisible spiritual world, but it affects us very deeply on a daily basis. This is the 21st century, unless you're listening and watching this video in the 22nd century. Can we believe in something which is invisible, that surrounds us, that is with us at all times? Because we sort of learn from an early age that those are the things of fairy tales. And the things of science are real. You can touch them, you can see them. They're as real as a bottle of ketchup is. I like ketchup. Can we believe in an invisible world that surrounds us and somehow affects us? Well, let's go back to a somewhat earlier scientist than a 21st century scientist, a 17th century scientist, and his name was, he was Dutch, so his name was Antonio van Leeuwenhoek. If there's any Dutch people out there, they can probably pronounce it. This is what his name was. Antonio van Leeuwenhoek. His name was Tony, and he was a scientist who used a new invention, which was called the microscope, to look at very, very small things. And he was amazed to see that there were little things moving around that were too small to be seen by the naked eye, which is what most of us are equipped with. He called them, he had a name for them, little animals. I forget exactly what he called them. And what he was seeing basically were bacteria. Bacteria are one form of microbial life, life which is too small to be seen with the naked eye. Another type of microbial life that we're all familiar with are viruses. And the type of microscope that Tony was using was not powerful enough to see viruses. Viruses were discovered much later. And it was discovered that when you built filters that could remove bacteria, sometimes things still got through that made other things sick. And there was something getting through the filters, and we discovered these are viruses. And it became apparent to scientists that we are surrounded by something which is invisible, which affects us very much, but which we can't see. Now, this is being recorded in Tammuz of 5780, and I am inside my house right now where I stay most of the day because of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is caused by a little teeny virus, which I have never seen in my life, maybe some pictures from electron microscopes. And since I'm at home, and a lot of us have been davening at home, not going to shul, one Shabbos, shortly after the quarantine began, I was saying Psukei de Zimra, which is the morning psalms that we say on Shabbos morning. And in shul, sometimes, frankly, they go kind of quickly. But I was by myself, and I had the Psukei de Zimra, and I spent an hour going through these psalms in a way I'd never done before. And they talk about the grandeur of God. God created the mountains. God makes the sea smash against the land. And we're told that the land says, has protected radioactive sand to keep it from being destroyed. God made the entire cosmos, the sun, the stars, the planets. Everything is made by God, and we see God's grandeur. And yet, I was staying home because God created something which is not huge and magnificent, but very, very teeny. And so teeny that I can't see it and no one around me can see it. It's called a type of coronavirus. And because of this teeny thing that we can't even see, the world has been brought to its knees. Commerce around the world has halted to a large extent. And none of us here in Tammuz of 5780 know where this is going. You, my dear listener or watcher who may be watching this a few years from now, know, but I don't. And I'm seeing the power of God through teeny little things that I didn't know existed. I'm not going to go through the story of Eliyahu, of Elijah, the prophet Elijah, on Mount Carmel, but you should look into the prophets in the Bible and read it. It's an extremely important story. And after it's over, Eliyahu runs away from his mission. He can't do it anymore. And he goes into the desert. And there's a big storm. And it doesn't impress him. And then there's an earthquake. And it doesn't impress him. And then he hears a still, small voice. And he recognizes God's presence. And that impresses him. And as I was sitting there saying these psalms on a Friday night by myself, I was less impressed by God making the cosmos and the mountains and the seas than I was by God making a little teeny thing, which is invisible, that is surrounding lots of places in the world. And I will not show you the mask and face guard that I have that for the occasions where I dare venture out that I use. And I certainly hope that a year from now, nobody needs to use those anymore, please God. So that was one of the first examples in science of things that we can't see, but are real and affect us. Another one kind of came in the 19th century. My favorite physicist was a man named Richard Feynman, and I can't talk about it here, but Feynman. If you look him up, you'll find him. I think the greatest physicist was Isaac Newton, but my favorite is Richard Feynman. And he was asked who he thought the greatest physicist of all time was. Oh, by the way, I should tell you that I worked for 40 years as a physicist, and now I have achieved my life's career goal, which is to be a retired physicist, which is much, much better. But anyway, Feynman was asked who his greatest physicist was, and he said James Clerk Maxwell. Now, I don't know to what extent the average person have heard of Maxwell, but every physics major has heard of Maxwell. Maxwell unified electricity and magnetism. Now, what does that mean? We all know what electricity is. You know, we have static electricity. You walk across the rug and you get a shock. And we have electricity that comes in our house through wires and so on. And we all know what magnetism is. It's a force that a magnet holds things to your refrigerator. Now, what's amazing is that Maxwell studied magnetism long before there were refrigerators. So I'm not quite sure what he had to stick his magnets to, but that's besides the point. They seem like different things, magnetism and electricity. He showed that they're this part of the same phenomenon, which is now called electromagnetism. And every physics major learns about this the first year that they're studying physics. And they learn about something which I'll put up now, which may look confusing to some of you, but every physicist who sees this will immediately say what it is. And here it is. Okay. All you physicists out there, what have I put up? These are called Maxwell's equations. And they were his magnificent contribution to physics. E over here means an electric field. B means a magnetic field. And as to the rest of it, well, take a course in physics and you can understand what that is. These showed that electricity and magnetism are, again, a single phenomenon that sometimes has electric effects, sometimes has magnetic effects. And Maxwell was able to unite those. And I think that one of the reasons that Feynman regards him as the greatest physicist to ever live is that the goal of physics, as it's usually stated, is to unify all the forces of nature and show that they're all the same thing. We now know pretty much of four forces, which are electromagnetism, gravity, which makes things fall down, attracts us to the Earth, and then two other forces that we don't encounter because they're very in daily life unless we're physicists, called the strong force and the weak force. The goal, just as Maxwell unified electricity and magnetism and showed they're really one phenomenon, electromagnetism was unified with the weak force back, I think it was the 60s, don't quote me on this, by Weinberg and Salam, and I forget who else. It's been a while since I retired. And they showed that they're really the same phenomenon, but come out different ways. And people are working on what they call GUT, which is the grand unified theory, to show that electromagnetism and the weak force, now called the electroweak force, are really part and parcel of the same as the strong force. And now you would have two forces, the electroweak strong force and gravity. And then the goal of physics would be to form what is show that gravity is really the same phenomenon as the other forces and achieve what is called TOE, the theory of everything. Now, we are not there yet. We're pretty far from it. It's interesting that physicists kind of assume that there is an underlying unity in the world. And even when I've spoken with physicists who are atheists or profess to be atheists, they believe that there's an underlying unity. But why should that be? To us as Torah Jews, well, why would there be an underlying unity? Because the whole world proceeds from a unity, which we call the Ribono Shel Olam, which we call God. And as you get deeper into some of the more Kabbalistic or mystical ideas, and these are things which I don't know. They're things that I speak about but don't know about. There's a lot of things that I speak about that I don't know about. This is one of them. We see that there are all sorts of ideas about how this multiplicity in the world came out of the unity. But the assumption is there's a unity there. And the physicists all believe, maybe not in God, but in there being an underlying unity. Now, one of the things that Maxwell did with his wonderful equations, and I want to show them again, because they're really, when you get into these, and you really study these a lot in physics, they are what is technically known as cool and neato. And they show a lot of stuff. And from his equations, Maxwell was able to show that the magnetic field and the electric field, okay, they have directions, can oscillate in space and form waves. And from these equations, he was able to calculate how fast those waves move. And it turned out that they move at the speed of light. And people had always wondered what light was. And in the 19th century, at that time, it was believed light was a wave. Nowadays, we know it is a wave, but it's also a particle. And if that bothers you, well, that's quantum mechanics. It's been said if you're not disturbed by quantum theory, you don't understand it. We won't get into the here. We did that in another lecture. It occurred to him that light was an electromagnetic wave, and that because that's the speed at which it moved. Sorry, I dropped something which I will need. So excuse me for one moment. We'll find it. We'll find it in just a minute when the time comes. Okay. So he predicted that in addition to light, which would move at the speed of light, there would be other waves that would move at the speed of light. And they might have a different frequency. They might vibrate at a different rate. Light vibrates at a very fast frequency. Some of them might be slower. And it turned out that later on, people like Hertz were able to actually produce and measure these waves. And in addition to light, we have other names for them. We call them X-rays, and we call them radio waves. Radio waves, microwaves, these are all electromagnetic waves that come through space. And we can't see them. And can we believe in them? Well, I have here a box. And as you can see, nothing up my sleeve. That's why I'm wearing short sleeves. It's an empty box. There's nothing in this box, is there? Well, is there really nothing in that box? I have here a small radio. And let me put this radio in the box and turn it on. The radio is working inside the box because these radio waves go right through the sides of the box. And even when the radio is turned off, this box is filled with radio waves. They're going through it right now. And my brain has radio waves going through it right now. Physicists refer to radio waves as RF, stands for radio frequency. And we live nowadays bathed in RF. We have radio stations. We have television stations. We have microwave stations that are transmitting information, such as the internet. And internet information is going through my brain and your brain right now. We have cordless telephones. We have cell phones. We have remote controls. We have a myriad of things that are producing RF at all times in our lives. And we live literally bathed in RF. And does it have any effect on us? Not that I know of, but there are some people who are concerned with what happens when you take a cell phone and put it next to your ear and you get more radiation in your brain. Nobody has shown that that is really harmful, but the fact is we don't know. It's an open question about whether we're affected by this or not. We certainly are affected by what we listen to and what we see on the internet. This is another example of something which is with us all the time, and it's real, and it is totally invisible. And right now it's here. I am recording this on July 15th, and it is to be put on the internet on July 16th. So let me say something about July 16th. July 16th of July 16th of 2020, all right, happens to be the 75th anniversary of the first man-made nuclear explosion. During World War II, the Americans, and the Germans, by the way, but that's a whole other story, worked very hard at the Manhattan Project to produce the first atomic bomb. And it was tested on July 16th of 1945, exactly 75 years ago, at a place called Alamogordo, New Mexico. And the place where it was tested was called the Trinity site. Now, at this point, I have to leave this a minute to look for what I dropped, which I need. And the question is, where did it go? Excuse me one moment, please. Maybe this can be edited out. For a short time there, you did not see me. because the camera was not pointed at me. And therefore, even though I continued to exist, I was invisible. How's that for trying to make this look like a demonstration? Huh? Okay. The Trinity site still exists in Alamogordo, New Mexico. You can go there. Not allowed to go to the actual site anymore because people have been picking up relics of it. And it's a desert, so there was sand. Now, the atomic bomb made an explosion which was pretty hot. As they say, there's different degrees of hot in physics. There's hot, and then there's a higher degree, which we call taka hot. Well, the atomic explosion was hot, taka hot momish. It was so hot. Now, what happens when you really get sand hot? Well, it's made out of silicon dioxide. It melts, and it produces something which we call glass. It's quite an old technology, making glass. In the time of the Gomorrah, it was well known. And some of the sand that was at the Trinity site became melted and fused into glass. Now, not real high quality glass. And it had a greenish tint to it. And it came to be called green glass. It is now called trinitite, a mineral found only at that site, this melted glass. It's interesting that there were some people who were arrested and two of them executed as the so-called atomic spies in America, the Rosenbergs, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, a whole story in itself. And one of the relatives, I believe that it was Ethel Rosenberg's brother, I think, was named David Greenglass. And that stuff which is found at the Trinity site is called green glass. Just an interesting coincidence. From a Torah viewpoint, we don't believe there are coincidences in the world, but that doesn't mean that we understand them when they occur. We don't. And being that I am a physicist rather than a normal person, a friend gave me a very nice gift in a beautiful little gift box. I don't know if you can you see what it says? Probably not. But it says Trinitite, July 16th, 1945. And inside this box is a little velvet bag. And inside this velvet bag is the kind of gift you would only give to a physicist. And it is a small piece of green glass, of trinitite, from the Trinity site. Now, shortly after the explosion, this was pretty radioactive. Not as radioactive now. I can hold it in my hand. Now, I have here a little Geiger counter, which I'll turn on. And if I put the trinitite near it, let's make sure this is on. Just a minute. Yeah. Yeah. Every time it makes, every time it makes a little blip, it is because there's some little particle, subatomic particle, passing through it. These that we're seeing right now are due to what we call natural radiation. Some of the natural radiation comes from the house that I'm in. Some of it comes from outer space as cosmic rays. Now let's see what happens if I put the trinitite over here. Not a lot. If you watch this over the period of a few hours, you will see that you do get a few more particles in it than you do just from this background radiation. There, you're seeing a few of them now, okay? More than we saw before. It's not terribly radioactive. But putting my valuable physicist gift away, I have something else over here, which is a little piece of uranium ore. And if I put this next to the Geiger counter, well, there's a lot of radiation there. All right, not enough to be dangerous to handle a little bit like this, but this got quite a bit of radiation. Now, what's happening here is little invisible particles are traveling out of the uranium, which is in this uranium ore, my Geiger counter, which is registering them and so on. By the way, I will tell you that I had to go for a certain type of cardiac stress test where they inject radioactive material into your body. And they have gloves and protective equipment and everything. And they said that I was the first patient ever to come to the nuclear medicine center bringing his own Geiger counter. I took that as a compliment, but I am told there is medication for that. Now, let's look again at this radiation that's coming from the uranium. If I put my finger in the way, what's happening? Those little particles, they're probably beta particles, they're probably electrons coming out of the radioactive uranium here, are going right through my finger as we speak. They're going through my finger. Do I feel them? No. Can they affect me? Let's hold that question for a minute, okay? But there are, in certain places, at least like with uranium ore, little teeny particles that we can't see. What about the rest of us? Are we surrounded by them? Well, if I keep my Geiger counter going, you'll see from time to time it gives a blip from there's one now. That could be a cosmic ray. That could be a piece, something from the granite in my kitchen. I have granite countertops, and granite has some natural radiation to it. It could be from some of my food, because we do eat things that are radioactive. Like, do you like Brazil nuts? Well, Brazil nuts are one of the more radioactive foods that we eat. But probably the most radioactive food that we commonly eat are bananas, because bananas have potassium in them. Potassium in them. That's easy for you to say. Potassium in them. And many doctors will recommend that people who have low potassium eat bananas or take potassium supplements. It doesn't matter which it is, it's still going to be slightly radioactive, because potassium has various isotopes, and one of them is radioactive, and they take it out. Now, is eating bananas dangerous? The radiation levels are not enough to bother us, because we're getting so much radiation anyway, all the time from around us. Does it affect us now? Does eating bananas affect us in terms of the radiation? What about cosmic rays, some of which come from the far parts of the galaxy and have been traveling literally hundreds of millions of light years to get here, and then they come into my Geiger counter and it goes boop, and they're gone. These types of radiation are with us always. We are bathed in various levels of radiation. Does it hurt us? Well, if you were to speak to any nuclear scientist or any person who works with nuclear materials, they would say that as long as the radiation you're getting from something is low compared to our background radiation, don't worry about it. It's a reasonable thing to say. Since we always have the background radiation and we can't do anything about it unless we live in a deep lead house, you know, or go down underground, more of that later, then it doesn't make any sense to worry about it. But does the background radiation having any effect on us? The answer is probably yes, because when people reproduce, we know that there's genes that come from the father and genes that come from the mother, and they combine in certain ways, and mutations can occur. One of the possible causes of a mutation is a particle, high energy particle that you can't see. In other words, some radiation interacting with the molecule. So radiation can cause genetic change. We know that high degrees of radiation can cause enough genetic change to cause cancers. In In the years following World War II, it was very tragic, but people would wear watches. In those days, the watches had hands that were painted with radium and a phosphor so they would glow at night. And this was done by women with brushes, painting this radioactive material on them. And they would very often straighten out their brushes with their mouths. And a lot of these women became very, very sick with cancers. And it was just not known at the time that how dangerous this was. When I was a boy, I used to go to the shoe store with my mother, children's shoe store, and I loved going because they used an X-ray machine to look at your feet to see how the shoes fit, and you could look through a little viewport as this. It was actually a fluoroscope, and I could wiggle my toes and see them going. And nobody knew how dangerous the radiation of X-rays was at that time. It was just fun to do in a shoe store. I don't know if anyone's ever done a study of whether people who owned those shoe stores had more illnesses associated with radiation. So it's here. Radiation's here. Pretty much can't stop it. Don't worry about it. Hashem's got it here for a reason. Can it cause mutations? Can it cause things to happen in our body? Well, yeah, it can to some extent. Hashem made our body so that genetic damage gets repaired. It has mechanisms for repairing genetic damage. Sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes, you know, a child is born with, looks a little different than the parents, or, you know, maybe the nose is longer or whatever. And it may be a result of some particle that came from outer space and did this. And Hashem made all of this because it's a way of influencing what happens in the world. And it's with us always, but it's invisible. We don't perceive it, we don't see it, and know that it's going on right now. Talking about right now, look at my hand. There are some cosmic rays going through it occasionally, as we saw on the Geiger counter. But let me tell you something about another kind of radiation. And this is one, most people have heard of cosmic rays, but many people have not heard of the radiation I'm going to talk about. And that's called neutrino radiation. Now, most people in high school learned about neutrons, that the nucleus of an atom has protons and neutrons. And neutrinos are very different than neutrons, okay? Neutrons are fairly heavy particles. Now, when I mean heavy, I mean they're so light, one neutron is so light you couldn't weigh it. But compared to other subatomic particles, they're reasonably heavy. Electrons are a couple of thousands of times lighter than neutrons are. Neutrinos are at least 1,000,000 times lighter than electrons are. All right, at least 1,000,000 times, and maybe less. When I was going to graduate school, and that was in the days where we didn't have notebooks. We used to have clay tablets and keep our notes that way. It was believed that neutrinos had no mass. They didn't weigh anything. It has since been discovered that they do have mass, but it's very, very little. It's also been discovered there are 3 types of neutrinos: the electron neutrino, the tau neutrino, and the muon neutrino. Fascinating subject. Neutrinos produce a type of radiation called neutrino radiation. Hey, you're beginning to get the hang of this, huh? And they interact very weakly with matter. They interact so weakly with matter that a neutrino from here could easily pass all the way through the Earth and come out the other side, and almost always will. To have a good chance of stopping a neutrino, a single neutrino, you'd probably need like a half a light year, trillions of miles of lead. That's how, well, how do we know that they're there if they interact so weakly? It's because there's so many of them. Because there's so many of them, some of them will interact, but very, very few of them do. Now, one of the primary sources of, oh, by the way, I have to tell you that when I was an undergraduate, I worked for a summer at Brookhaven National Laboratory in Long Island. excuse me, it's properly pronounced Long Island, New York. And they were doing an experiment to see if there were more than one type of neutrino at that time. And they had a source of radioactive particles, and they had to filter out to make sure that nothing got through to their experiment except neutrinos. So what they did is they had 150 feet of concrete blocks and battleship armor. I still have a picture of it. And nothing got through there. The neutrinos just sailed right through. And that's how they got their source of neutrinos to study. People who have studied neutrinos have used other types of filters. So, for example, there's an experiment where they took, I don't know the number, but thousands and thousands of gallons of dry cleaning fluid, basically, which has the proper composition in terms of the nuclei to occasionally stop a neutrino, and to make sure nothing else, no other radiation affected it. They did this in a abandoned mine, you know, like hundreds or thousands of feet underground, so that the only thing that could possibly come in there was neutrinos. They're with us always. Well, where do the neutrinos come from that we experience daily in our lives? Most of them come from the sun. The sun has a lot of nuclear processes going on inside it. And it is a fascinating story, not only of what the processes are going on inside the interior of the sun, but how we know that. In many ways, we know more about the interior of the sun than we do about the interior of the earth, but that's a whole other story. And the sun is producing lots and lots of neutrinos, and it loses some energy through these neutrinos because it keeps on sending them out. There was a famous physicist named George Gamow, and he referred to this as the UCA process. And he called it the UCA process because it represents a tremendous loss of energy from the sun, not enough to make the sun go out, don't worry about it. But it reminded him of a casino in a place called UCA where he lost a tremendous amount of money, and therefore he called this the UCA process. So we have all these neutrinos coming out of the sun, and even at nighttime, they're coming through the Earth, and we're being exposed to these neutrinos. So we have something else which is invisible, this neutrino radiation, which is with us all the time, even at night when it's dark, because neutrinos don't mind the Earth being in the way. They just come right through. And this is with us at all times also. Now, how much neutrino radiation is there? Well, every second, every square inch of your skin, every second is being crossed by approximately 400 billion solar neutrinos. Let me say that again. Every square inch of your skin right now has about 400 billion solar neutrinos passing through it every second. That's a lot of neutrinos. Do they hurt us? No. They don't interact with us very much at all. They really, we don't, you know, I think we can really make a case that neutrinos are relatively harmless because we haven't discovered any effects. By the way, that's famous last words for any scientist. We haven't discovered any effects. Okay, we'll leave that here. But you can't do anything about it. You got your 400 billion neutrinos per second passing through every inch of your skin right now. Let's talk about something else that we can't see that's pretty small and was discovered only recently and surrounds us. And something where we do not know if it has any effects on us or not. And something which was discovered recently and has only existed relatively recently. In many states, I live in Maryland, they are outlawing the use of styrofoam in packaging. If you go to a restaurant, they take out, it used to come in a styrofoam box. Now you get it in a recyclable cardboard box. And one of the reasons that they're passed the law against styrofoam is that many types of plastics can be recycled. I know, is this anything on it? Let me see. Sometimes you'll see on plastic a little number in a triangle, and this doesn't have it, and it tells you what class of plastic that is and how it can be recycled. You know, you'll notice that. Here's some over here. There's a little right over here. There's a little triangle with a 7 in it, and that's class 7 plastic and can be recycled that way. And it says that it is BPA free. It doesn't have any biphenyl something. So I'm not a chemist, so I can't get into that. But at present, with present technology, we can't recycle styrofoam. So what happens to styrofoam? Well, you throw it in the garbage. It goes into a landfill where it stays for a long time. Some of it gets in the sewer system and floats out to sea. And a lot of plastic that can be recycled floats out to sea. Now, at present, there is so much pollution from plastic in the oceans that there is an area of the Pacific Ocean stretching hundreds of miles in which there is floating plastic pollution. It may be as much as 1,000 miles. I may be understating it here. But you can look this up. And the question is, what can we do about it? And it's only been accumulating, you know, since we've been making plastics, which is, you know, relatively recently in human history. But in addition to that pollution, it has been discovered lately that plastic does something else, and that is it breaks into little pieces. Now, I don't mean little teeny pieces that you can see. It's a little piece of, I don't know, maybe a little piece of something I can't identify here on my table. I don't know if you can see that. It's on the tip of my finger, all right? It could be a crumb of challah left from Shabbos. It could be a little piece of plastic that broke off something. And that's pretty teeny, but I can see it. No, plastic can break into little particles that are so small, they're called nanoparticles, that even with a regular optical microscope, you can't see them. A microscope can see, you know, as we pointed out, it can see bacteria. A light microscope, optical microscope can't see viruses. These things are down in the virus class. That's how small they are. And these little nanoparticles are all over. I mean, all over. They went up to the Pyrenees, which are mountains in France, and they discovered that just in the pristine, high altitude, pure air, they discovered that every day hundreds of nanoparticles accumulated on every square meter of the top of the mountain. Hundreds of nanoparticles every day in the pristine Pyrenees. They're all over. And when I say all over, I mean they're in our air. We breathe them in. And they're in our food because they get into the water. They get into the soil. And from the soil, they're brought up into the plants because they're so microscopic. And we eat them. We breathe them and we eat them. And they're in our bodies right now. Right now, in our brains, there are countless numbers of teeny pieces of plastic. We don't know how to stop this. What was it? There was an article I saw the cover of Consumer Reports. They had an issue on how to eat less plastic. I didn't read the article. Are they harmful to us? We don't know. What happens when a little teeny nanoparticle of plastic gets into the brain where you have two neurons that are connecting to each other through something called a synapse? And the way that your brain works is one neutron sends its little message to the next one to make it to fire across something called the synapse. What happens if the little piece of plastic gets in that synapse? Does it affect things? I don't know. Nobody knows. Again, we are surrounded by things that until recently people didn't know about, that may or may not affect us, that are invisible. But let's go further. Let's go further towards an analogy to the spiritual world. Okay? Remember, the spiritual world is invisible, non-physical. Everything I have discussed so far has been physical. It has been invisible, but it has been physical. Let's talk about something that is not physical. Let me ask you the following question. Where is cyberspace? Cyberspace, well, I get into my computer and I type into it and I'm in cyberspace. No, you're not in cyberspace. You're on a computer that's connected to another computer on what's called the internet, which is a massive network of computers all around the world. And it's fascinating how it works. You know, a whole fascinating subject in itself. But that's not cyberspace. If I have a computer and I write a program for it, that program goes into the computer to make it operate. But the program is not a physical thing. It's can be written in typed on paper, can be written longhand. It's still the same program. It's some information. It's some abstract information that can be represented by something which is printed, represented by something which is. The cyberspace is an abstract concept that can be realized by computers. It can be realized by smartphones, which really are computers. It can be realized by other types of devices, which we have nowadays. Where is it? Well, out in the so-called computing cloud, there are computers with memories, and the information is in those memories, but it's shared. It's not, there are backups. The cloud doesn't rely on one memory for everything. It may have several of them in case one of them fails. And it's the same information. What matters is that information. That's what cyberspace is. Cyberspace is an abstract concept that is brought into realization through computers and connections. Just like the poems of Edgar Allan Poe are poetry. Once upon a midnight dreary, as I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore. That's beautiful. It's magnificent. When I write it down, I am putting that abstract poem into a realization, into a physical realization. But that paper and that ink is not the poem. The poem is the abstract thing. Cyberspace is abstract, an abstract concept, an abstract idea. And it isn't anywhere, and yet it's everywhere. It's not physical. Is it real? Is cyberspace real, even though it has no physical reality? Yeah, it is. To the extent that we might ask, can cyberspace, which is just an abstract concept out there, can it affect our daily lives? Oh, you better believe it. Yeah. Shortly before I started recording this, I was having trouble transferring some money from a bank, which has to go somewhere else. And I've still got to work on it. It's still not happening. My life is being affected by something in cyberspace. All right. Right now, I am recording from my house to somewhere else, and I don't even know where that is, using cyberspace. And those of you who are watching and listening to this lecture are using cyberspace. Can cyberspace have a good effect on our lives? Oh, yes. Website, Torah Anytime. Tens of thousands of classes available for free. All right. The Bar Ilan project that has taken tens of thousands of svarim, tens of thousands of great Hebrew works and made them available through computers. What wonderful things. What about telemedicine? Being able to show something to a doctor and find out, should I come in, shouldn't I come in? I had to see a doctor about a neurological problem. And I was able to show, if you've seen, as I lecture, I have what's called a tic disorder. And I could show her, oh, this is what the tics are, and how's it going, and how's my eye blinking coming. And we could do this via telemedicine. It's a wonderful thing. Can cyberspace be destructive? Can the internet be destructive? I don't have to tell you anything about that as to how destructive the internet can be if it is used improperly. Cyberspace, like many other things in the world, can be basically neutral. It depends on what we do with it. Just like this pen is a sort of a neutral thing. I could use it for good. I could use it for evil. I could write lashon hara, malicious gossip about someone using this pen and send it in a letter and do terrible things with it. I can write Torah thoughts with this pen and then use it for wonderful things. And then I elevate the pen spiritually. It's in my hands what I do with it. And what I do, we are told, just as when I punch my keys or speak, as it is nowadays with voice recognition, into cyberspace, I affect what happens in cyberspace, and cyberspace affects me. Similarly, we are told by Torah that there is an invisible spiritual world, and that the things that we do affect this spiritual world, and in turn, the spiritual world affects us. There are some Rabbanim, some rabbis who, as human technology has advanced, said some interesting things. When the telephone first came out, I don't remember who some of these Rabbanim were, who some of these rabbis were, but one said that, what does the telephone teach us? Why did God allow us to invent the telephone at this point in our history? So that we should be able to learn that you can say something over here and it can be heard all the way over there. A lesson we had to learn. What about bugging technology? Putting a bug in a room, okay? I will tell you that it is nowadays very sophisticated. And if you do not know anything about modern bugging technology, someone could put a bug in a room and you would never find it. Never, unless you knew the technologies. All right. So, people go to a foreign embassy and want to have a conversation that is secure. They sweep the room for bugs to see if anyone's listening. And it's hard to do nowadays. And there was discovered that during the height of the Cold War, the American embassy in Berlin had lots of bugs in it. The Soviets had an actual tunnel underneath and were recording what was said. Why has God allowed us to produce bugging technology and sound recording? Again, to teach us that everything can be heard and recorded. And as they say, I always have said that one of the biggest surprises some people get after their life is over in this world and they move to the next world and are before the Beis Din Shel Mala, the heavenly court, judging their lives, they are shocked to discover that there never was a right to privacy. One of the things we learned from bugging technology. One of the great Hasidic Rebbes, one of the great Rebbes of the 20th century, he may not have been Hasidic. It may have been Chavetz Chaim, I'm not sure. Said, why were movies invented? Why did Hashem allow movies to be invented? In order to show that something can be recorded. Everything that's seen can be recorded, okay? Now, why in our days has cyberspace come into existence? I would like to speculate the following. God teaches us sometimes through what's called a mashal. Mashal is a parable. And the meaning of the mashal is called the nimshal. When it came to the telephone, he taught us, you know, you can speak here, but it's heard over there. I don't know if we learned that lesson well enough. That's what the nimshal was, that we're being heard. So he moved on to movies. We can see and record everything you're doing. That's the mashal. So too in this world, everything you see and do is recorded. Did we get the message? Well, some movies out there are pretty awful. Then we come to cyberspace, one of our present mashalim. Why are we being showed that brought the existence of cyberspace now? Because it shows us that there is a reality, and it is a reality that is not physical. It's not physical at all. It's here always. It is affected by us, and we are affected by it. And that is real. The cyberspace is real. Can we believe what we are told in Torah, that there is an invisible, non-physical, spiritual world that is affected us by and that we affect? Can we believe that such a thing exists? Oh, you better believe it. Because we see through cyberspace, God is teaching us that such a world not only is possible, but does exist. And everything we do affects those higher worlds. Now, those higher worlds, there's a number of them. There's 5 higher worlds. We live in the Olam Asiya, the Olam Yetzirah, Bria, Tzilas, Adam Kadmon. These are Kabbalistic ideas. And I know some of these words. I can't say I know what they mean. I will say that there are many, 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 many more people who say they know something about Kabbalah than there are people who really know anything about it. But what we can take away from this is that everything we do here affects the spiritual world on its different levels. And those levels, in turn, are affecting us. And what I might see, I went to my rabbi, and I said to him, in my life, I'm 75 years old, and at this time you start looking over your whole life. I have seen that Hashem, that God has been showering me with brachas, with blessings, for my whole life in ways that it would take me hours to even describe how I know them. Things that some people would call accidents, you know, lucky accidents. The way I met my wife, long story. The way I got my job, I was in the same job for 40 years. All of the, and on and on and on and on and on. And here I sit in quarantine needing food. And from the local kosher supermarket, I get on my computer, I click on what I want, and I get it delivered to me. And I have lots of food that Hashem has given me. And there are people here in town who don't have as much food because they can't afford it. So that leads me to what any scientist or physicist would want to do in the closing of a talk, and that's to give a demonstration of some point. You know, I gave a demonstration with my Geiger counter, I gave one with my radio. I want to give a demonstration of how we can affect and change what's going on in the higher levels of reality. Okay? I'm going to do it for you right now. And I'm not joking. This is not a joke. Okay? I mentioned that here in Baltimore, there are many people who cannot afford to buy food like I can. And there's a wonderful tzedakah, a wonderful charity here called Ahavas Yisrael. And it provides money to help these people. And they need help. a lot of people who need help. Here's my pen, my neutral pen. Okay. Here's an envelope. All right. It is addressed to Avas Yisrael. Okay. Here is another item which is fairly neutral. It is a checkbook. Before your very eyes, I'm going to write a check to this Avas Yisrael charity. Just a minute. Avas Yisrael and the amount. Okay, I have now written a note, a check to that charity, which I have here. I have, again, elevated the pen spiritually. And now I am in the midst of an act of tzedakah. And when you do tzedakah, when you do a mitzvah, when you do any mitzvah, when you have a wonderful meal on Friday night and enjoy yourself, it's a mitzvah. You've done something that improves the world. What a concept. I mean, you could talk for hours about this. So I'm in the midst of a mitzvah, and I'm going to take this check, and I'm going to put it in this pre-addressed envelope, and I'm going to seal it. And I know that use some cellophane tape on this because the sealant on the envelope is not so good. And now, in order before, well, not your very eyes because you can't see it, but to do a real-life demonstration of affecting the invisible spiritual world in a real way that will not only affect me, but, and please learn about this as you learn Torah, it will affect you. I'm going to take this check to tzedakah, and I'm going to go out and put it into the mail, thereby doing the mitzvah of tzedakah. And you can't see this, and I can't see this, but the upper worlds are changing. And through them, the world is changing. It may be a small effect. I don't know. I'm going to do this now. So therefore, in conclusion, I'd like to say goodbye.